A very good morning to all students. Hello students, I am Dr. NeeluShrivastava and today I am going to take CharlesLamb's famous essay, Dream Children. CharlesLamb, as we know, is known as the prince among English essays, and he is like a shining star in the sky of English essays. Why he is called prince among English essays? Because he brought the finest prose in English literature, and he brought to the prose the finest qualities of romanticism. Lamb's readers appreciate him for his wisdom, for his humanity, for his genial humor, for his profound pathos, for his sweet temperament, for his friendly interaction with his readers, and for his beautiful style. He wrote under the pseudonym of Elia. So, the essay which we are going to study today is Dream Children, and as the title of the essay suggests, Dream Children are reverie. What is a reverie? Reverie is a sort of daydreaming when you are lost in your thoughts, and it comes from a pen of a man whose desire was always there to have a family, but due to some or the other reasons, this dream was unfulfilled. So it is a wish fulfillment in this essay of CharlesLamb, but it is an unreal world. It is a dream that never came true. But it narrates the haunting dream of the essays to have two children, a boy and a girl, who would cuddle up to him to listen to his tales about their great-grandmother and their uncle. So let's start the essay. Students, you should have the text before you to understand the essay in a better way. So I'll just read out. Children love to listen the stories about their elders when they were children, to stretch their imagination to the conception of a traditionary great uncle or grandam whom they never saw. It was in this spirit that my little ones crept about me the other evening to hear about their great grandmother Field, who lived in a great house in Norfolk, which had been the scene, so at least it was generally believed, that in that part of the country, of the tragic incidents which they had lately become familiar with from the ballet of the children in the wood. Certain it is that the whole story of the children and their cruel uncle was to be seen fairly carved out in wood upon the chimney piece of the great hall, the whole story down to Robin Redbreast, till a foolish rich person pulled it out to set up a marble one of modern invention in its stead, with no story upon it. So one day, the imaginary children of CharlesLamb, they came to him and they requested their father to tell them the story about their great grandmother, about whom they had heard from his father earlier. And then CharlesLamb told how his great grandmother used to live in a big mansion. It was a huge mansion where she lived, and that mansion was full of beautiful carvings on the walls, on its walls, that were wooden walls. And in that carving, the whole story of the children and their cruel uncle was picturized. It was depicted, and it could be easily seen, and the story could be a story could be taken out of that carving. And here Alice put one of her dear mother's look too tender to be called upbraiding. Just after listening this, Alice is the name of the imaginary daughter of CharlesLamb, and John is the name of the imaginary son of CharlesLamb. So when he was telling about their great grandmother, just after listening that, Alice, she just took the looks of her mother, who is no more now. Then I went on to say how religious and how good their great grandmother Field was. The name of their great grandmother was Field, and she was a very religious and very respected, beloved lady by everybody. She was not indeed the mistress of that house, but had only the charge of it. Yet she and in yet some respect she might be said to be the mistress of it, too committed to her by the owner, who preferred living in a newer and more fashionable mansion which he had purchased somewhere in the adjoining country, but still she lived in it in a manner as if it had been her own. And that house did not belong to Mrs. Field, the great grandmother of Lamb's children, but still she used to take care of that so sincerely as if it was her own house. And the owner of that house had purchased another house in an adjoining village, and he had shifted there, and she was just the caretaker of that mansion. Then I told how, when she came to die, her funeral was attended by a concourse of all the poor and some of the gentry too of the neighborhood for many miles round, to show their respect for her memory, because she had been such a good and religious woman, so good indeed that she knew all the psalteries by heart and a great part of the Testament besides. Here little Alice spread her hands. Then I told that she was such a great and such a great human being, that when she died, there was such a big crowd in her funeral procession, and many poor people, and they had gathered at that time when the funeral procession was taking place. And she was a very religious woman. She had learned all the testaments by heart. She could play the psalteries by heart. And just after listening that, Alice spread her hands in amazement, in astonishment. Then I told what a tall, upright, graceful person their great grandmother Field once was, and how in her youth she was esteemed the best dancer. Then I told that her great grandmother had a very impressive personality. She was a very tall and and beautiful looking lady, and she could dance so well that she was esteemed as the best dancer. And I was saying, in the country, till a cruel disease called cancer came and bore her down with pain. But ultimately she got a very cruel disease that is called cancer, and she had to subdue to that disease. But still, in spite of having that disease, she did not her spirit, she never bent her good spirit and make them stoop, but they were still upright, because she was so good and religious. Then I told my children that she used to sleep by herself in a lone chamber of the great lone house, and how she believed that an apparition of two infants was to be seen at midnight gliding up and down the great staircase near where she slept, but she said those innocents would do her no harm. And then she told then CharlesLamb just recalled that his grandmother used to tell them that she used to sleep in a lone room, in a all alone there, and such since it was a very big house, it was a big mansion, she has seen at midnight the apparition of two infants. Apparition means the shadow of two infants gliding up and down the great staircase. Maybe they were the spirit of two dead children, but those innocents never did any harm to her. So when she told this story to CharlesLamb, he got very much frightened, and he was and in those days he used to sleep with the maid, but still he was very much afraid by listening this story by his grandmother. Then I told how good she was to all her grandchildren, having us to the great house in the holidays, where I in particular used to spend many hours by myself in gazing upon the old bust of the 12 Caesars that had been emperors of Rome, till the old marble heads would seem to live again, or I to be turned into marble with them. Then I told that I used to go to my grandmother in my vacations, and she used to be so happy just by seeing her grandchildren's with her. And there especially CharlesLamb used to enjoy the carvings of 12 Caesars which was on the walls, and he used to gaze on those carvings so minutely that he himself became statue with them, or those carvings or the pictures became alive with him. So he was very much involved in those stories which were carved on the walls. And then uh, yes then Yes, and then said that I sometimes in the spacious old fashioned gardens, and which I had almost to myself, unless when now and then a solitary gardening man would cross me, and how the nectarines and peaches hung upon the walls without my ever offering to pluck them because they were forbidden fruit. And he says that Lamb used to enjoy the garden, which was a beautiful garden there, full of the flower, full of the fruit trees which were there. And but since those fruits were forbidden to be plucked, he used to be there just having a look on those nectarines and peaches. Nectarines are a sort of fruit like peaches, and without ever offering to pluck them, but he never dared to pluck them because they were forbidden. And because I had more pleasure in strolling about among the old melancholy looking yew trees or the firs, and picking up the red berries and the fir apples which were good for nothing but to look at. And I could almost fancy myself ripening too, along with the oranges and the limes in that grateful warmth. Since it used to be winter vacation, he used to bask in the sun, and he could feel as if he is also getting ripened with, along with the fruits which are being ripened in the sun heat. Or in watching the days that darted to and fro in the fish pond at the bottom of the garden, with here and there a great sulky pike hanging midway down the water in silent state, as if it mocked at the impertinent friskings. I had more pleasure in these busy idle diversions than in all the sweet flavors of peaches, nectarine, oranges, and such like common baits of children. So CharlesLamb was little different from others children who used to enjoy the oranges, nectarines, and other fruits in the garden. Instead, he used to enjoy just by observing these fish in the pond and the birds in the garden and all. And then in a more yes, here John Silly deposited back upon a plate of bunch of grapes, which not unobserved by Alice, he had mediated dividing with her, and both seemed willing to relinquish them for the present as irrelevant. And just when I was telling them about their great grandmother, my son John, he just in a naughty manner, he took the fruits which were kept there in a plate, and he started relishing them. Then I told how their great grandmother Phil loved all her grandchildren, yet in an especial manner she might be said to love their uncle John. Then he told about his brother JohnLamb. Although their grandmother used to love all her grandchildren, still she had a special love for JohnLamb, because he was a king to the rest of us, and instead of moping about in solitary corners like some of us, he would mount the most mettlesome horse he could get, when but an imp no bigger than themselves, and make it carry him half over the country in a morning, and join the hunters when there were any out. And yet he loved the old great house and gardens too, but had too much spirit to be always pent up within their boundaries. And how their uncle grew up to a man's estate as brave as he was handsome, because JohnLamb, he was the most handsome children out of all the brothers and sisters, out of all the siblings. And he used to take the horse and go for a horse riding for a long distance. And he was so lovable person that everyone used to admire him. And how he used to carry me upon his back when I was lame footed boy, for he was a good bit older than me, because John Lamb was older to Charles Lamb. So when once Charles Lamb had got his leg fractured, he used to take Charles Lamb over his shoulders and roam him out here and there. And how he used to carry me, but he was a good bit older than me, and he used to carry me a mile when I could not walk for pain, because Charles Lamb was unable to walk. So he used to carry Charles Lamb on his shoulder for miles. And how in afterlife he became lame footed too, but I did not always make allowance enough for him when he was impatient and in pain, and nor remember sufficiently how considerate he had been to me when I was lame footed, and how when he died, though he had not been dead an hour, it seemed as if he had died a great while ago. And his lovable brother John Lamb, he died out of some disease, and when he died, it had not been an hour of his death, but Charles Lamb was feeling as if he has died long back. So he says that such a distance there is between life and death, and how I bore his death, as I thought pretty well at first, but afterwards it haunted me. And the absence of his brother John Lamb, it used to haunt Charles Lamb too much later on. And I missed his he says that I missed his kindness, I missed his crossness, and wished him to be alive again, to be quarreling with him rather than not to have him again. So he says, I wish he could come back so that I could just quarrel with him again, and was as uneasy without him as he, their poor uncle, must have been when the doctor took off his limb. And actually John Lamb's one of the limbs was cut. So he now Charles Lamb was actually realizing how John must be feeling when his one of the limb was taken away. And then children fell crying and asked if their little mourning which they had on was not for Uncle John, and they looked up and prayed me not to go on about their uncle, but to tell them some stories about their pretty dead mother. Then my children requested me to tell them something about their pretty dead mother. And then I told them how for 7 long years in hope, sometimes in despair, yet persisting ever, I quoted the fair allies. And as much as children could understand, I explained to them what coyness and difficulty and denial meant in maidens, when suddenly turning to Alice, the soul of the first Alice looked out at her eyes with such a reality of presentment that I became in doubt which of them stood there before me, or whose that bright hair was. And while I stood gazing, both the children gradually grew fainter to my view. And then I told my kids that how I used to spend 7 long years in quoting their mother. And I could, and because the kids were very small, I could not make them understand what coyness, what shyness is for a lady. And sometimes I was in hope, sometimes I was in despair whether she would accept my love or not. Then I explained to them what the maidens are, what sort of qualities they have. But suddenly I found that my kids, Alice and John, they are receding back and back, and they were receding continuously till nothing at last but 2 mournful features were seen in the uttermost distance, which without speech strangely impressed upon me the effects of speech. We are not of allies, nor of thee, nor are we children at all. The children of allies call Bartram, father, we are nothing less than nothing in dreams. Actually, they were the dream children, they were the imaginative children. So they said that we are neither Alice nor we are John, because their mother, she had married some other man, whose name was Bartram, and the children of Alice, they call Bartram their father. We are nothing less than nothing, we are only what might have been. We could have taken birth if the marriage of CharlesLamb and Alice had taken place, and we, to be your children, we must wait upon the tedious shores of Lethe millions of ages before we have existence and a name. And immediately awakening, I found myself quietly seated in my bachelor armchair, and then I realized that it was just a dream. And it is quite pathetic that CharlesLamb, he had a liking for kids, and he had a desire to have children, and but unfortunately it could not be possible. So Lamb selects the names for his dream children intelligently. Alice reminds one of the Alice in Wonderland, a dream world, and John Pierre's relation with his brother John. Lamb liberally intermixes facts with fancy. We see that when he speaks of John as a child, he makes the character so fanciful with all his lustiness that the tale warms up the children. But he soon gets him dead to make the children fall a crying. So this is a wonderful essay written by CharlesLamb, in which he shares with his readers his unfulfilled wishes of getting married and having 2 children, and to have a happy family, which could not have been possible. So I hope you could understand the essay well, students. We will meet in another lecture. Thank you.